Okay, I'm going to get started. If you have any questions, you can drop it in the chat or you can unmute and let me know. So today I'm going to go over how to use the rights table to think about this week's readings and how to put that into perspective of the readings that you've been doing so far. And so now you should be turning the corner towards your final papers and your final exams. So there's a few terms that we have to understand from the very beginning. We start with the basic idea of the private sector, which usually involves businesses that are incorporated, they have license, or they can carry on as a variety of different options. So one of them is to be a sole proprietor, another could be an LLC. There's a large number of entities that you can form to operate as a business. And this is what we generally mean by the private sector. The public sector, on the other hand, which is something more students are familiar with, is anything that is funded by a government agency or comes from taxpayer funding or is a government agency itself. So the MTA would be a public sector, Kingsborough Community College is public sector, politicians are in the public sector, there's public health care institutions, but then there's also private healthcare institutions. So NYU, for example, is private, but there's a public hospital in Brooklyn, for example. The American dream is the belief in equal opportunity for prosperity as an individual right. And this is something you'll hear kind of pretty commonly spoken about, that people believe in the American dream. You'll see what relationship this has to the public and private sectors in a second. Equality is the idea that there's a playing field that does not discriminate or favor one against another, and so it's equal. Equity, on the other hand, argues that the playing field is already biased towards the people who know the rules of the game, who play the game, and also for those who make the rules and design the game. And then finally, rights talk is the belief that rights will be enforced, that if you have a right, you're in an equal playing field, then you will get your day in court or you'll be recognized. And so we want to start with the basic idea already, however, that the 14th Amendment and the 4th Amendment do not apply to the private sector. I'm going to say this again because this is hard for a lot of students to grasp at first. The 14th Amendment and the 4th Amendment do not apply in the private sector. They do apply in the public sector. And this is kind of one of the first difficulties that you need to start to understand about private actors and public actors. So this is largely what the case Plessy versus Ferguson is about. The question is complicated, of course, because should the 14th Amendment apply to a private company who operates a train, but they use public railroad tracks? And so this is the kind of big setup that's happening in the time of industrialization, is that the idea of separation between private and public is starting to be blurred. This same controversy will occur again in the 1950s involving a private motel, but that is on a public highway. And so these are kind of the larger issues that even today you're seeing stuff with, like Facebook. Should a private corporation be held to the same rules as a public corporation? So should Facebook be responsible for actions that other individuals take? And so the court uses logic that is based in something called separate but equal, which means that the races should be kept superior versus inferior. This is also known as originalism, and it's the idea that those who founded or settled the United States should be given more important rights than those who come in later, whether as immigrants, enslaved, or migrants, right, residents who don't have any legal status. The court argued that private sector trains should not be regulated, and in many ways this is still true today. There's not much about the private sector that is regulated through the constitutional amendments. So it's important to understand that only the public sector, the government-funded projects, can be analyzed for discrimination at the federal level. States can go ahead and pass their own laws. So if they don't want trains to segregate, or they don't want housing to segregate, or they don't want banks to discriminate against people, then the states can pass their own laws. But those laws cannot be passed at the federal level. Federal laws can only apply to government-funded agencies. Also, the Fifth Amendment protects states. So it doesn't just protect you and me, it protects states as well, the courts have argued. So states are entitled to due process, which means that they cannot intervene, the federal government cannot intervene into the private sector. Now, the 14th Amendment protects individuals against states. So the state gets the Fifth Amendment, the individual gets the 14th Amendment. So this is where it gets obviously complicated because the two amendments are contradicting each other. And so a state cannot violate individual rights. And so you have to have this process now where they're going to balance the state's rights versus the individual's rights. And so you'll see this in the conflict in the reading of the politics of land reform. And if you look at the various rebellions that are going across the world and even in this country at this point now, is that what we're talking about is it comes down to economics. So the court is balancing the interests of the state and carrying on business, making money, giving jobs, producing things, versus the rights of individuals who hold rights that are in some ways less important to the larger economic interests. And so this is kind of important, is that you don't have Fourth Amendment rights in the workplace. Say if you work for Amazon or you work for another private corporation, unless the state government has given you a specific right. So in other words, it's not the Constitution that gives you that right. It's not the Bill of Rights that gives you a right. It would have to come from the state. So New York State would have to have a law that prohibits private corporations from engaging in certain practices. You will not get that from the federal government. Now, this also applies to the 13th Amendment. So people believe that slavery was outlawed, which is not even remotely close to being true. Slavery as an economic practice was transferred from private individuals over to the state. So slavery, if you look carefully in the 13th Amendment, is allowed if it is the punishment for a crime. And so states take what is called a monopoly over the slave labor. Now, unless you're a migrant. And so migrants don't have legal status, they don't have American citizenship, and so private actors can enslave them and treat them discriminately. They're not protected by the Constitution. Now, that doesn't mean they should do that, it's just that they are able to do that. So this brings us to the conclusion here, is that there's this new kind of talk, there's this new idea about crimmigration, meaning what used to be a civil law, what used to be non-criminal, has suddenly become criminal. In other words, the state is now entering into the monopoly that corporations were having. Corporations up until the 90s could do basically whatever they wanted with migrants, and they were largely hiring them. Then you had kind of the politics shift, and people have started arguing that there should not be unauthorized immigration. And instead of blaming the corporations that were hiring people, people have started to blame individuals. And what you saw in the courts is that corporations have rights. That's in the Citizen United case. And so you can't, the federal government cannot break into a corporation's ranch or their farm and start asking people for their immigration status unless a judge allows for what we call to pierce the corporate veil. But this is balanced against the business judgment rule. So most situations, judges will not interfere with how a business runs its business. If there's probable cause to get a warrant to look for illegal activity, then the judge would pierce the corporate veil, meaning there's something that the owners of the corporation are doing that there's probable cause that it's criminal activity. Now this gets complicated with immigration because, like I said, it's not a criminal law. You are not a criminal if you enter the country without paperwork. That's a civil law violation. It would be the same as if you were going to a court to settle your property ownership if you got an inheritance or if you were divorced. Again, that's not a criminal issue, and so it's unlikely that federal officers would be able to pierce the corporate veil and start looking at immigration matters of a private business. Now again, in public, the government, public hospitals, public schools, they all have to follow the rights and law under the 14th Amendment in federal law. Private corporations, on the other hand, do not have to. So this brings up the big question from a political or social point of view is, what do you do with the migrants? And this is where we get into that, what I'm trying to get you to see in this class is the constituted identities. Remember that at the beginning, at the founding of the country, migrants were kind of everybody, right? Nobody was really immigrating to the United States in 1787. People were being brought in as slaves. So this was all for economic reasons. If you fast forward today, you've got the same process. People are being brought into the country for economic reasons, particularly migrants, and yet they don't have any legal status. They don't have any legal rights. And so this is the big kind of question now of if you believe in the American dream, you can see now that it is not being applied equally to all. And so we don't really have an equality system that's going on in the United States. So this goes back to the separation of private and public and how the Constitution favors the private sector against the public sector. And so this will be really important as you start thinking about your final weeks of work. Okay, for those of you who are here, are there any questions?